Hello, everybody. This is Eve Louise Ewing coming to you live for the first ever Q&A in our Black Freedom Lecture series. Very, very excited to see you and even more excited to welcome my colleague, C. Riley Snorton. I'll tell you, I'm there. Now I don't have to hear my own voice as I talk. I'm even more excited to welcome my colleague, C. Riley Snorton, who's going to be our first guest today, talking about the topics of Black trans past, histories, presents, and futures. Before we begin, I want to do a couple of things. The first is we want to provide a land acknowledgement. We are both coming to you from the city currently known as Chicago, which is on the occupied lands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa nations, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. As Black people, we see ourselves in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples that are the original stewards of this land, and in fact are looking forward to having a much deeper conversation about that in a couple of weeks. We hope that you will all join us. The second thing I want to do is acknowledge that it is an extraordinarily difficult and heartbreaking day for us here in the city, because today is the day that the video of the brutal murder of Adam Toledo was released by the Chicago Police Department. There is nothing we can say about the spectacle of unnecessary death at the hands of state violence that has not already been said. We are in mourning, we are hurting. And so we're actually going to begin our time by just taking a moment of silence in recognition of Adam, the life that he will not get to lead, and his family. So please join us in doing that, please. Thank you so much. And we will be continuing to have conversations about the many forms that state-sanctioned violence takes throughout this evening. We encourage you to take care of yourself, however you may be feeling. This is an extraordinarily challenging time on top of all of the mourning and hurt that we are already dealing with every single day. So please join me in welcoming my esteemed colleague, C. Riley Snorton. Professor Snorton is a professor of English language and literature at the University of Chicago with a joint appointment in the department in the Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies. Professor Snorton is a cultural theorist who focuses on racial, sexual, and transgender histories and cultural productions. He's the author of a couple of great books. One is Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low, and Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. If you didn't get a chance to already catch our video that dropped last week, you can hear Professor Snorton read from the preface of Black on Both Sides, and some of those comments are going to frame our conversation today. The book Black on Both Sides has won a lot of amazing prizes, including the Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction, the Sylvia Rivera Award in Transgender Studies, an honorable mention from the American Library Association, shout out to librarians. And Snorton is also the co-editor of Saturation, Race, Art, and the Circulation of Value. Please join me in welcoming Professor Snorton. Yay, people are clapping for you and celebrating you. I also see that you have a really great hoodie on that's made by our collective, our shared friend, Pigeon Pagonis. And if folks don't know, you should go get your own Too Cute to Be Binary shirts and hoodies on Pigeon's page.
Absolutely.
How are you feeling?
I am hanging in. And I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be in conversation. I want to thank folks who are tuned in and listening. And I want to thank you also for providing that moment for some collective grieving, or perhaps to collectively feel enraged in this particular moment. It happens to also be, I believe, National Day of Gratitude. So I think it's kind of appropriate to start with some thanks, even as we're holding a whole set of emotions all at once.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. And I think that it might sound discordant, but for me, gratitude is one of the things that keeps me going on days like today, because I know that our community is really strong and that we are organized and that we are prepared to show up for each other in the ways that are necessary. So I also want to welcome our ASL interpreter, Barb, and say that I'm really grateful for her being here. And also to say thank you. I promise I'll stop since you said it was gratitude. Also to say thank you to the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture for making this conversation possible, and the Mellon Foundation, and all of our amazing staff and partners who've made it possible for you and I to hop on a computer and talk. Okay, so I have so many questions for you. I also want to let folks know that they can post questions in the chat, and we will be, if we have time, and if I don't run my mouth for an entire hour, I would love to ask questions that people have. So please feel free to post questions in the chat, and I'm sure that Professor Snorton would be open to answering questions that are not just about the lecture. So if you have general, smart, interesting questions, please share them. Okay, so I'm going to be doing a lot of like, what did you mean by that? Because your lecture just dropped so much truth and so much that really left me with a lot to chew on. So the first thing I want to ask you about is you frame the preface of your book by talking about what you call the necessary simultaneity of Black liberation and trans liberation. I'm so proud of myself for saying the noun simultaneity, the necessary simultaneity of Black liberation and trans liberation, right? That one has to happen alongside the other. Could you just talk more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure, sure. What a great way to get into the conversation. So let me think about how I would start to unpack that. In one sense, what I'm suggesting is that if we think about gender as a kind of the modern system of gender as a colonial construct, that in many ways, and as the book kind of lays out in later chapters, necessitated, for example, kind of brutal experiments on enslaved Black people, which creates the conditions for the possibility of something like transgender to emerge in the mid 20th century. Then we see one of the ways that Blackness and transness are imbricated with each other or share a relationship with each other. Now, certainly it's not the same thing, but they are interrelated processes. And so if we think about the liberation of Black folks, we also are also calling for a liberation to the ways in which the colonial construct of gender has been mapped onto the ways that Black people experience themselves, but also as it continues to be a kind of ongoing site of pressure, of violence, of a kind of rendering of proximity to premature forms of death that structure how trans people maneuver in the world. I think certainly, by kind of talking through Laverne Cox's own kind of site of public grief, it really highlights also the ways that we see the kind of violence against trans communities as, in fact, being much more acutely attuned to Black and brown trans people. And so these are, these are not only allied, but they are implicated political struggles.
Are you saying, tell me if this is an incorrect rephrasing of what you're saying. Are you saying that we should understand the invention of something like Blackness or the Black as a category and the invention of something like gender and binaristic categories of gender as both happening at the same time through the same colonial project? Would that be accurate?
That's great. And I would say, in addition to that, that the kind of sexual scientists, the ones who are developing what it is that we take as the kind of precepts or the kind of ways of thinking about gender as being mapped onto anatomy and et cetera, right? Gender and sex, that those folks were also deeply involved in eugenicist projects, right? Mm-hmm. So that the kind of the pathologization of transness and Blackness are happening simultaneously as well.
Literally by the same people, the same folks. That's really, I really appreciate that framing. And I think that one of the things I think that is powerful about your work and about your book is the idea of exploring Black trans histories. I think that because many of us grow up in a very patriarchal society, which we'll talk about, and a very kind of gender repressive society, that people think transness like just got invented or this came out is a new thing. Could you talk a little bit about some of the trans people, Black trans people moments in Black trans histories that you write about in your book that folks should go look up and learn more about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think part of the reason for looking at the past, that there were really two reasons that I wanted to write a history. One was precisely a kind of reaction to the idea that trans people are new. And it seems like, I mean, even if you look at the 20th century, like people thought trans people were new when Christine Jorgensen becomes this kind of celebrity figure in the early 50s. But then, you know, it gets reinvented over and over again. One might say that people rediscover trans people whenever there's a kind of emergence of a trans celebrity. The other reason, though, is that like I was deeply interested in thinking about what kinds of strategies for living did Black trans people deploy in the past that we might be able to think through and use and be inspired by in the present and in the future. And so some of the figures that have been so meaningful and exciting to learn more about include trans figures who come out of the 1950s or who we know about from their lives in the 1950s, um, who have often been not given their due attention in trans histories, but who are, you know, there are people like Carlette Brown, who's a shake dancer in Harlem, who is like really actually trying to seek getting out of the country in order to get her proper, you know, the kind of medicalized surgery that she was interested in. There was another woman named Carlette who's actually from Chicago.
Two Carlettes.
Yeah, this is the story of two Carlettes. Popular name must be in the 50s. So yeah, so there's a story of a Carlette from Chicago who famously told the court, like, if I'm a man, then I don't know that, nor does my community. And so, you know, there's just all of these stories where, I mean, often we don't know about them except by the ways that they were criminalized. So we get them through court records and the kind of sensational media stories that were told about them. But in these stories are also like there's like beautiful and inspiring moments of people talking back to the state that is attempting to construct them other than how they see themselves. I'd also say that some of the most fascinating work was looking at stories of Black trans folks living in the 19th century. And one of the, a kind of chilling artifact, which is a pickup notice, a notice that people used for to enlist slave catchers or to find formerly enslaved Black people who had escaped and bring them back to their enslavers. There was a pickup notice of a person who, you know, they were like, believes well, I'm gonna use the pronouns that I feel most comfortable with. Believes she's a woman, believes she's free. And to like see those sentences side by side in this notification of a person who was in jail and awaiting the kind of possibility of whether or not they were going to be brought back to their enslaver. These are the kinds of stories that populate and live across Black on both sides.
That juxtaposition, believe she's a woman, believe she's free, is astonishing. And it points to something you said a minute ago, which is, how do we look at these histories for exemplars of the freedom dream, right? And that's something I want to touch on more, because I think a lot of what you were pushing towards in your lecture was ways of thinking about Blackness and transness that is not about seeking state inclusion. Right. And I have really detailed notes on this. You wrote, the quantified abstraction of Black and trans deaths reveals the calculated value of Black and trans lives through state grammars of deficit and debt. And what you're calling for is the opposite, where you said media focus on trans people's abilities to use the bathroom of their choice obscures a more urgent conversation about what modes of dispossession are possible under the ruse of state inclusion. What would a trans politics in theory look like that refuses such murderous inclusion? So I could just quote back smart things that you said for a long time, but help us unpack that. What do you, and how do we think about, this is a big one, I think, for all marginalized peoples. how do we think about our sense of aspiration beyond a desire for inclusion in the same systems that dehumanize us? Right. So what else is there? Help us see something else, Riley. What else should we be asking for?
Mm. So I want to, so, I'm tempted to go with several different metaphors. One about what does it mean to try to get a seat at the table when the table is broken. One about what does it mean to try to get into the house when the house is on fire. And so I'm thinking, right, like the kind of project of inclusion is often freighted by this idea that somehow by including, we also will be transforming and making that very space better.
Right.
While at the same time, we survive by way of other modes and other systems. And so I think part of the project in Black on Both Sides, and especially in this current moment where we're seeing a proliferation of anti-trans bills at the state level everywhere, right, is, it is about looking to and valuing differently the kinds of structures of support that make Black and trans survival possible. And so, some of that is about the various ways that we've already provided roadmaps for thinking about other ways of survival, other ways of safety, other ways of mutual aid. And so the pivot can't be, what does it mean to become a full citizen in a state that in many ways and through many functions and institutions is able to maintain itself by way of
Our devastation.
exclusion. That's right. And so this is the kind of language of deficit and debt. Like this is also the ways that capitalism works. That like it is to say, sometimes inclusion is about sometimes inclusion can become a way to further expose oneself to technologies of extraction, to technologies of dispossession.
Wow. Yeah. That is inclusion. Like people really want it. They really want to be part. And it's the thing that we're trained to want. It's the thing that we're told to want.
Yeah.
And I wonder, relatedly, I wonder how you resist the idea. So one idea that I think you just kind of disabused us of is the idea that like freedom means inclusion at a poison well. Yeah. Another thing I would love to hear your thoughts on is the idea that what we should aspire to is the visibility of our own demise, right? Like that the more videos and the more kind of graphic representation of death, the better. And I think that for trans people, this is obviously, I think for all Black people, this is salient. For trans people, this is really salient because how do you, on the one hand, strive for recognition? How do you strive for remembrance? How do you strive for acknowledgement, for memorialization, for all the things that we know our lost siblings are due, that they are owed, while also not making that the totality of how our bodies are seen? So help us through that.
I think, it's interesting. I was actually thinking about visibility before you said the question, because I think I often think about when we consider what visibility can mean, we also need to consider visible to whom.
Right.
And so I think very often people are like, oh, so-and-so is invisible, but I'm like, but they're visible to me. They are cared for in these communities. And so, there is a kind of another dimension for me in kind of the research and writing and political work that I'm doing that's about holding a space where people can be honored and valorized without necessarily becoming instrumentalized. And I think that that's some of the trickiness of visibility. It's obviously something that many of us deeply care about, to feel recognized, to feel seen. But it's also that and I think particularly when we think about things like the various ways that the many deaths of Black and brown, mostly trans women have been mobilized towards efforts where they are no longer in the room. They're no longer
Right.
leading those efforts. They are no longer, their voices are no longer being heard. And so to kind of think that the kind of spectacle of violence somehow we have to disarticulate that the spectacle of violence means justice for those who are most likely to be violated or to be abused in the kind of broader social.
Yeah, especially because, as you said, we are already visible to those for whom we are beloved.
Yeah.
And the systems that harm us are already visible to us, right? And so this idea of like uplifting the visibility of those things, I think you're really prompting me to think about to whom, for whom, and for what ends.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that it's never good or purposeful to kind of, work on this issue of visibility, but it's like for what, right? There's a moment you already mentioned, the iconic Laverne Cox, and there's a moment in your lecture as well as in the preface where you talk about an interview that Laverne Cox is doing, and she kind of interrupts the flow of time by she's doing this interview, and she stops the interview to acknowledge that she is in mourning. And you said she is challenging teleological notions of progress. Can you explain what that means to people who may have never heard the word teleological before,
Sure.
and why it matters?
I mean, I think the quickest way to describe it is that like she is purposely disrupting an understanding of time as moving from point A to point B, and the logic that we experience change over time. One of my favorite ways of thinking about that is actually in the work of Invisible Man, where the unnamed protagonist says that he experiences time like a boomerang, that it keeps hitting him, right? And this is how he knows how he's located in time, not as a kind of A to B progression or on a linear progression, but rather that time can work most often works in a cyclical fashion.
It's kind of like that's like an echolocation version of time. I've been writing this book about Afrofuturism for like a million years, and one of the things I think one of the if I ever finish, hopefully I finish it, but I'm not gonna I'm trying out here, but to me one of the most important ideas in Afrofuturism, as I understand it, because part of why I like to write about Afrofuturism is that it's unsettled. So I get to make an argument. So in my vision of Afrofuturism, exactly what you said is really important, which is I think that Black people have always had a very nonlinear vision of time. And I think that there's so much that becomes possible when we stop thinking about time that way. One thing that it reminds us to do is to resist the notion of progress that you're talking about. And I have to say, with love and respect to people who use this phrase, one of my least favorite phrases is like, I can't believe this is happening in insert year here, right? And people said it 10 years ago, they said it 5 years ago. And it's like, at some point, maybe the year that it is doesn't matter, right? Maybe this eternal return of the same thing. There's not a question there. I just want to talk about Afrofuturism. But if you want to say anything about Afrofuturism, go for it.
Well, also, big admirer, reader, student of. But yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying as well was just making me think a little bit about, so often how we experience time is as it's invented by, for example, capital in the sense of the time of work, or as it's invented by the state, as in it's also tax day, right? That like there's all these ways that like if we think about time, if we unsettle time, we also get to be inventors of time too.
Yes. So 2 things before I ask you my next question. One, I want to remind folks that if you have a question, you can post it in the chat. Second, this is a great time to mention, because we've been talking about how incredible your book is, that we will actually be giving away some copies of your book. And so if you are watching this video and you want to tell us what you think of our conversation, there's a really, really short feedback form you can fill out, and we'll be sending it out through our newsletter, which is at blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. If you sign up for the newsletter, we'll send out the feedback form probably on Monday, And you can get a copy of Dr. Snorton's incredible book. And we'll be purchasing those from Semicolon Bookstore, which is a Black-owned bookstore here in the Chi. So another word that you used in your lecture that some people might not know, but that I think is really helpful, is the idea of sociogenesis. Everybody's going to come away from this talk about, like, I hope everybody has their vocabulary notebooks out. What is sociogenesis, and why is that a helpful concept for us to, why is it a helpful word for us to know?
So sociogenesis is a term that comes out of Frantz Fanon, and
the OG that people
exactly the only epigraph of the preface in the book. The problem under consideration here is time. And part of what he is doing in Black Skin, White Masks is setting up an understanding of, like, there is no way of understanding an individual's pathology without also thinking about what is pathological about the culture or about the social.
Oh, you ain't said nothing but a word today, because wow.
Right. So it's about the inextricability of the self and the social. And so part of then the way that term gets taken up, and by for example, Sylvia Wynter, is to say, well, if we're talking about there is no necessary distinction between an individual and a kind of larger social collective, then we get to reinvent what it means to be, for example, a human, what it means to be and this is what, I feel like is part of what Blake Brockington was doing in his political organizing, right? He was like redefining what it means to be trans in relation to his particular social setting in North Carolina as a Black activist, as a trans activist. So I hope that kind of begins to demystify that term a bit more.
Yes, I love it. I wrote making a we, right? It's like how we make a we collectively in space. Could you talk to us a little bit about Blake Brockington and about his story and why it's a story you wanted to include in the book?
Yeah.
If you feel able to do so.
It is. I mean, I want to take on the question. And I also feel like in thinking about Blake Brockington, it makes me think about the situation of today, and sitting with what is it, one way of beginning to respond is to say that I believe 33 is considered the age of elder, like being an elder status as a trans person, given the set of circumstances in which so many folks are prematurely murdered or die. And so I remember seeing the news stories of Blake Brockington winning the Homecoming Award, and I was just like, whatever, like interested in that as a piece of news.
Right.
And then I remember seeing the news of his death and thinking about, at that time, probably just at the time of like seeing that, probably had just become, elder status as a trans person. And thinking about, what I think Janet Mock also has said so beautifully in Redefining Realness, that is about like, the context of being politically aware and being oriented towards Black and trans survival and thrivance is a way of sitting also with survivor's guilt. And, Blake grew up in North Carolina. I spent a lot of my childhood in South Carolina, and I just really wanted to meaningfully reflect and to insist on honoring his life, especially as so much of what you would find online, even now, is oriented around his death. But I think it was also about imagining what it would have been like for us to have had some kind of other mode of sociality. What would like to imagine what those conversations are like. And I think in some ways, this Black on both sides, and some of the newer work that I'm thinking about is like, what does it mean to honor the dead? What does it mean to learn from ghosts? What does it mean to live with ghosts? And Blake is just a really important person to me.
Mhm.
Since the book came out, I've met so many folks who have been friends of Blake,
Mhm.
and that's been some of the most incredible conversations where, in some ways, to briefly return to our conversations that we were having about visibility, it was about the often and very reasonable fear that so many trans people have about being misremembered in and after their death. And so for that to be there and for people to let me know about their relationship with him, it really amplifies the kind of stakes, both
Mhm.
political and ethical, of what it means to name some of these folks who we continue to be in community with through other spiritual modes.
And it really, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And second of all, I think it really highlights what we were talking about a minute ago in terms of visibility, because there's a form of remembrance that is making someone visible on the terms through
Yeah.
which they desire their visibility. And I think that that's really important. And yes, also very interested in what it means to continue to have these relationships spiritually with our folks after they're gone. And I think that when we lose people, it amplifies the necessity of that, right? Like you have to develop some sort of spiritual or ancestral practice, I think. I'm going to ask you a few more questions, and then we have a couple audience questions. So this is my last vocabulary question, I
Okay.
promise.
No problem.
Talk to us about the word tranifesting, which
Yeah.
is a great portmanteau that you mentioned in the preface.
Yeah. So first, shout out to Kai Green and Trevor Ellison for developing the term. And their sense of it is that kind of collective sense of self-determination. And so it felt important to also highlight that there is language that is already in circulation about what it is that's at stake. And there's a lot, there's a big conversation, and maybe some of the questions that people have are about thinking about the kind of shared desire for self-determination among trans folks and among Black folks. But that was a gesture of community incitation, and also a way of saying, again, that like that people are generating the language to name what it means to live in extraordinary and unimaginable circumstances.
Yes, thank you. That was I was like, I'm so glad I learned this word today. Um, so one of the things you mentioned, HB2 and also the more recent spate of anti-trans legislation. And in the education community, I want to shout out some of my colleagues who have done a lot of work to try to really highlight the way that this legislation specifically targets young people.
Right.
Um, could you talk about what do people need to know? I know this is not your, totally, you're not a legal scholar, but you are a very knowledgeable person. What do people need to know about these legal fights over the rights of trans people to live their lives unencumbered that are happening right now?
So, um, first, let me say that my political orientation is for the complete decriminalization of trans people, right? And that these bills look very differently. Some of these bills are about restricting trans people's movement, i.e., whether they can go to the bathroom. Some of these bills are about and there's a particular bill that I think is in fact just being discussed today, that about teachers having to report if young people are
Yes.
trans.
Yes. Engage in
Um,
looping in teachers as kind of carceral agents of the state.
Exactly, exactly. And so, they have a lot of different particularities, and the fight to respond. I mean, shout out to Chase Strangio, and a number of folks who have been doing this work through ACLU, through Trans Law Center, through Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. But what I understand to be needed is that they're going to have to take it to each state and do a kind of court proceeding. There's a lot of labor and resources that are needed to respond to this slate. And I hope that these organizations are ones that people will consider supporting.
Can you tell us of if there's one in particular that's your favorite that folks should go look up and drop some coins if they can?
I don't want to pick favorites, but I'll
Okay.
say those names again.
Everybody get your pens out.
Yeah. I'm lifting up the the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. I'm lifting up Transgender Law Center. And I also want to say that there's a really strong trans advocacy division in the ACLU.
In the ACLU. Got it. Okay. Got it. You know, as I'm hearing you talk, I think right away of the iconic quote from our always mother, Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
And the reminder that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And that idea of distraction is what comes to mind, right? When I hear about this push, this wave, because it is such a waste of the time of so many talented people, and it's really, I think that's another form of hurtfulness. The most direct hurtfulness is the ongoing criminalization of trans people and trans young people and trans people of all ages that we know compiles upon these other systems that we're already talking about, right?
Yeah.
But man, like what a waste of time.
Yeah.
Like what a massive waste of time. It's really frustrating, really
frustrating. Yeah, it's super frustrating. It occurs as pressure. It's like when so often we've been talking about living in and with a COVID pandemic while also living in a kind of epidemic of state violence, an epidemic of anti-trans the word that I often use is animus because it kind of it's a scaffold for all
contempt,
kinds of
hate, yes.
Exactly. And anti-Black animus and violence. And so, it's like it's like in some ways it's like feeling like you're in a pressure cooker.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And then also then like imagining then all the kinds of folks who have to be marshaled just to turn it down a little bit, just to deal with the bill that is coming up in one particular state, because each of these are going to take their own legal strategy and legal team.
And I hope that the educators who might be watching this really think about the ways that our schools are already set up to normalize the surveillance criminalization of our young people that facilitates, it makes it really easy to engage in something that is truly evil and truly immoral under the guise of I'm just following the rules. I'm just doing my job, right? And that we're asking teachers as state actors to potentially put their jobs and their livelihoods on the line and make a decision, right? But that's a decision you have to make, right? So I want to call on folks to think about that and to be prepared, to be courageous,
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to ask you 3 more questions from me and then 2 more questions from I think just 2 more questions. Well, possibly more. Oh, good. Okay. Somebody asked the same question that I was about to ask, which is this person and I would like to know. We said, we really appreciate your idea of entanglement as not quite the same thing as solidarity. Could you talk about that more? Shouts to that person. We're right here.
Yeah. So I've been wondering about what it would mean for us to truly see each other as ourselves. And I think often solidarity is, I think it's powerful. I think it's beautiful. I often sign my emails in solidarity with meaning. But I often think solidarity is about saying, well, these are my issues and these are your issues, and we're going to come together. And so I've been trying to think about what entanglement offers that is that ratchets up the stakes of solidarity in a certain way, where it's like, honestly, as I understand my situatedness toward liberation, it cannot happen without you. And so this is the language that I've been reaching toward. But I also think, it's a way of thinking about like not just who do we bring and what do we bring to the table, but what do we have to give up in order for this other new world to emerge. And so, so much of what this moment of living in the public health pandemic, the global public health pandemic has meant for me has been to be really a kind of better student of abolition. And I think from that framework, I've been thinking entanglement, and I've been thinking about all the things we gain by losing some of the things that we might imagine are important to how we identify ourselves.
All the things we gain by losing the things that we imagine are important to how we identify ourselves. That's really incredible. I also really like the word entanglement because Jada Pinkett Smith has now forever redefined how we think about entanglement. So it's also kind of like a wink and a nod to Black people, like entanglement.
Yes.
So I want to build on what you just said, because you shared that this year has created a pivot point in your thinking about the relationships between Blackness, transness, and abolition as interrelated practices. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key ways that I see those as interrelated practices is through something that I'm really in the kind of early phases of trying to wrap my mind around, which is like what's possible by embracing a political political imperative, thinking of it as a kind of benefit to us to operate from the principle of uncertainty. That like, what would it look like if it wasn't that we were trying to say, oh yes, trans people should be here and non-binary people should be here, but to really sit with uncertainty as a way of organizing what we think we know about our gender and anybody else's gender. And so I've been thinking about this is in some ways born out of some conversation, a kind of conversation that I've been sitting with for a while, where people were kind of around the dinner table talking about like, oh, this is pre-COVID. We were around the dinner table, but we were talking about.
I was judging. I was definitely judging it.
I was like, we were talking about like what would how would we have something where trans people actually got to live more livable lives? And one person said, well, like I think it'd be meaningful if we could really get to acceptance. And I was like, because it's like I think part of it is that like I think so much of what is so hard in surviving as a person who lives with multiple identifications that are targeted is the way that the kind of engine of security and of the carceral state is the idea of being sure about something. And as acceptance still requires a thing like, oh, I know this thing, and now I've slotted this thing into being. It still can exist within any sort of sense of ordering. And I want to say, what if we actually were like, I've got to actually embrace. I actually feel like I'm entangled with you, and I don't know for certain under what conditions it is that we are going to develop. What other modes then would we have for what it means to even be related to each other at all? And so that's the kind of stuff that I've been really just trying to wrap my mind around, and doing it by moving into a project that's about inhabiting swamps.
Swamps like a writing project? Are you writing about swamps? Oh my gosh, that's so cool.
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks. And also we need to keep talking because, some of it is also about swamps as this place. It's not land, it's not water.
Right.
It's a non-binary place. So like, what does it mean then for people to go and inhabit this space that's known for being so difficult for human life? I think some of that might actually give us some vocabulary for thinking about uncertainty, to refuse the sense of knowing as the necessity for building political strength, political relation. So yeah, I'll pause there though.
Oh my gosh, you just gave me so much. Like first of all, I think people who are interested in like this idea of a liminal space between land and water, the book The Black Shoals by Tiffany
Please.
Lathabo King is a great
Yes.
book that folks should check out. As a Midwesterner, my interest in swamps is purely academic, but I am with you. I'm entangled with you in your swamp inquiry.
Yes.
I don't want to
Yes.
go,
Okay.
but I will defend to the death your right to engage with this one. I'm into it. And I think that the other thing that emerges from what you're saying to me is I think that like, now everybody the phrase white supremacy is now like more prevalent than ever before. And one of my friends said to me yesterday, I think a lot of people don't know what they're talking, like what they're
Right.
saying when they say white
Yeah.
supremacy. And I said, well, part of what we're trying to do is move the average, right? So if more people understand more than what they did, I am okay with that. But I want to highlight something you said, which is that to me, one of the many insidious instantiations of white supremacy that is maybe less visible is the idea of like completely knowing something, right? The idea of that you can capture, fully
That's
understand,
right.
categorize, hold, own something entirely is to me an idea that comes from kind of white Western orthodoxy.
That's right.
The idea of cataloging things infinitely, right? Putting them in museums, measuring skulls, and the idea that there's not space for kind of an infinitely unknowable sacred, or what you're calling the uncertain, I
Yeah.
think is really something worth pondering. And now I want to get a shirt that just says like I'm uncertain, which is how I feel all the time about everything.
Right.
So thank you for
Me
that.
too.
I'm so uncertain. Um, one of our audience members wants to know if you don't mind returning briefly to this question about the legal battles that are happening. What is it about this moment? Why now do you think that there's this moment that these laws are being enacted? And what do
Right.
you what does that represent or reflect to you?
I mean, in one sense, I think, Morrison has it right. It is about a certain kind of distraction. I think in another sense, it's, I don't, so this is, I'm putting this out as a hypothesis.
I'm
Right?
ready. We're uncertain.
Right?
We're very
Yeah,
uncertain.
yeah.
Very
But I
uncertain.
think that we're also in a particular kind of transitional time where we have in the US the kind of new presidential outfit, but we also live in a time where there has been more continuity than there's a lot of continuity in terms of the same kinds of white supremacists, anti-trans, etc., as a kind of mobilizing tool for for politics in this country. And so I think in some ways they also seem like easy wins. Like, yeah, like this will help rally our base, mobilize our
Right.
base, satisfy our base. But I'll also say this, that like I don't often allow myself to dwell in what is the rationale for
Mm,
producing that kind of thing. I often think like when something is is it, the impact of something is misery, that is a kind of attenuated form of terrorizing particular groups. I find that I often like I actually don't want to know how they link those things up.
yeah. Yeah.
But I do think that it's seductive for some.
Yeah.
Like the fact of it's being so plentiful means that it's useful for a kind of marshaling of a group of people who imagine themselves to be disenfranchised in this moment.
Right, which is a trip.
Yeah,
It's a trip. And I think that's right. Like you don't want to put yourself in that headspace too much. But, from a pragmatic perspective, they wouldn't do it if they didn't think it was effective.
that's right.
And to me, it's a cause to self-interrogate because these things require a kind of mass support, right? Like they wouldn't do it if they didn't think that enough people would at least not oppose it. And I think that
That's right.
it's really important to educate ourselves about some of these arguments around like sports and participation and all these things that, in my view, are predatory on people's very poor understanding of gender.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
if you understand something like binary sex and binary gender, then a question like, well, if these kids are allowed to be on the sports team with these other kids, then how is that fair? Right. And I think that it becomes a moment to interrogate the seemingly reasonable arguments, right? That are, I don't hate these kids, but is it fair? I'm like, is it fair that I had to be on a basketball team and I'm not good at basketball? Like,
Right.
is that fair?
Exactly.
No, I
Exactly.
wanted to
Right.
be reading books. And
Yeah.
so I think that, but these things rest on a facile understanding of gender, that I think people need to interrogate within themselves. And that brings me to another question I want to ask from the audience, which is, how do we help people be aware? This comes from Tatiana. Hi, Tatiana. How do we help people be aware that white supremacy is not the only system of oppression we're up against? How do we bring awareness to how patriarchy is enmeshed in global society? And also, this is kind of a two-part question, but I think the second part is also really important. How do we stretch our understanding of masculinities
Mm,
outside of patriarchy? So those are two separate things, but I would love if you feel like you can
yeah.
tackle both. Number one, how do we help people get an intersectional analysis of white supremacy and patriarchy? And over here, how do we think about masculinity in ways that is not like violent and patriarchal? Or is that for you a useful exercise?
Got it. So the first one makes me think about bell hooks, right? The bell
Great.
hooks has that, like, like when bell hooks names the problem, she always names it as an ever expanding compound, right? She's like white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, classist, ableist violence. And I'm like, it's like these are when people are talking about white supremacy, right? Like white supremacy is also, right? Like in the same way that
Yes.
race and gender are not, right? Are not
Yes.
the same, but white supremacy, requires patriarchy. It's a part of it.
Yes.
It's a part of its engine to function. Capitalism is a tool inside of also of white supremacy, right? So like thinking the simultaneity of those things is also to say that like we say we're naming one thing, but we also are I think it's about increasing awareness that saying one thing is also to always invoke these other things, that
Right.
these are cast of characters in the same play, right?
So be like bell hooks is what you're saying, and don't be afraid to
Yeah,
make the list.
that's right.
Yeah, and it takes us back to, I'll let you get to the second part of the question, but it
Sure.
takes us back to where we started
Yeah.
about part of your claim is actually you can't understand gender as a construct
Yeah.
separately from understanding racism and race as a construct, separately from understanding gender as a construct, right? That these things are co-created as a violent colonialist white supremacist project together, part and parcel. It's like thunder and lightning, right? And so I think that's helpful, but also naming all the things.
Yeah.
Be
Yeah.
the bell hooks that you wish to see in
That's
the
right.
world, and just
That's
name all
right.
the things.
That's
And
right.
could you tackle that second question about, are there ways to understand masculinity outside of patriarchy? And I really appreciate this question. It's something, I would like to be a parent someday. I'm a parental figure to many children that are not my own. I would like to be a parent someday myself, but I have a lot of friends with boys, and I'd be looking at them like, I don't know how y'all finna raise these boys. Like, it's
Yeah.
terrifying to think about if we want to move past something like toxic masculinities, right? We just have so few models of what it looks like to think
Mhm.
through maleness or boyness that is not
Mhm.
about violence. So can you give us some, or should we abandon it altogether?
Well, such a
By
big
abandon it, I mean abandon masculinity as a concept.
no, yeah, no. I'm hearing everything that you're putting down, and it's something that I think about so much, and particularly as a non-binary and transmasculine person, because in some ways, there are so many scripts that are offered up by way of patriarchy, and there's also that the reality of sexism that is also not only like sexism is not something that only men have, right? We have to also
Right.
tend to internalize sexism. So bringing it into the realm of parenthood is also something that I think is really really important as a context here. And so, I mean, if we're going to talk about what does it mean to abandon, my first kind of question is like, what if we teach all our children that they're making their gender as they go? What if we teach all our children that, like, I think one of the things we should abandon are like gender reveal, because that's not
Oh,
good.
that is, first of
You
all,
know, like
a menace to society and a
true.
menace to the forest.
Exactly.
Right?
Like, a menace to the environment.
Oh, and to y'all people, y'all,
Yeah.
please stop endangering yourselves with these gender
Yeah.
reveals. I
Yeah.
beg of you. If you're watching this,
Yeah.
don't do it. You will set a fire.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think that I take that very seriously in my own kind of transmasculine identification, that I am making a kind of masculinity while also being attentive to, I have been socialized in this world,
Right.
and so certainly it is about constituting a world in which each person gets to determine and then give language to, if they choose to, what it is that they how it is that they are moving in the world with all various kinds of attributes. I think I gave you a kind of thesis on gender abolition.
No, it was amazing. Yeah, no, I think that's amazing. And I think that I don't know, it's really hard because it's one of those things where once you start looking for it, you just realize how much it's everywhere and how much, as you said, how much we've internalized, right? And yeah, it's just terrifying. So many good questions are rolling in. I do not want to keep you all night. If you have a question for Professor Snorton and I don't get to ask it this evening, please check Professor Snorton out on social media and don't ask too many questions, but ask some questions. All right, I'm going to ask two more before we go, and I want to remind folks one more time. You can sign up for our newsletter at blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. And if you do that, you can get a form to enter a book giveaway and get a copy of Black on Both Sides. All right, last two questions. Number one, this comes from Selena. Shout out to Selena. A friend said they don't believe solidarity is a thing because none of this is solid. There are holes, shaky foundations, etc. That was a bar, but then there's a question that comes with the bar.
Mhm.
How do we align ourselves with things we support but may not fully understand? I think this is a really important one. How do we forge alliances even when we don't fully understand somebody else or where they're coming from?
Well, this feels like it really echoes the conversation that we're having about uncertainty. That, like, that I think, in terms of what it means to kind of develop oneself, to be a student of something, it is like, what is it that feels ethically, politically urgent? And it doesn't quite matter, right? Like, whether or not you can fully understand why it is that you then require a relation to do that which feels politically and ethically urgent towards the liberation and survival of the communities that we are part of and care about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing I would say to build on that is that this is why relationship is so important. And that if you are in relation with people, you do not need to fully understand them in order to want to protect them.
That's right.
And I think that there are limits to, empathy was probably like the most misused word of the TRUMP administration, because it's like we need to have empathy, but empathy with the wrong people, but I think that for if you are truly in relation to somebody, empathy can be an important pathway towards saying, I got your back, I'm entangled with you, regardless of whether I've read all the Fanon or the Sylvia Pinter. All right, Riley, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I want to say thank you so much for being such a gracious interlocutor and for teaching us so many vocabulary words, for being so cool. So what kind of you talked a little bit about eldership, right, and about how the kind of the terror of untimely demise faced by many young people who are trans forces us to think differently about eldership. I want to flip that and say that maybe we can define, even without the specter of early death, right, that maybe we can be thinking about our status as elders. What kind of elder are you trying to be? What kind of elder do you want to be? Share with us your aspirations for elderhood.
Got it. I mean, I will shout out my mom on this one, who was so moving to me one day. She gave me a compliment, and she was like, my favorite thing about you is that you're kind. And she was saying it in light of like something that had happened that was like really exciting for me professionally, But I take that, I think about that all the time. That like
Yeah.
for me, it's most important to be kind, to be generous, to be with folks in ways that, in all the ways possible, are not about my ego, but
Mm,
about what it is that we can build together. To not be concerned about becoming irrelevant. Like, I don't care, if the work is useful, that's great. I'm always interested in being in the conversation, but it should not be about me. And so
mm,
like, that's the kind of elder that I am maturing into, I hope. But it's also something that I constantly have to orient myself around. And I think that like, I guess another thing to say then too is to like be intentional about
right.
the um the values that I hold dear. I love that question. I love that question.
Thank you. I got it from listening to you. I think that I actually feel, I'm not going to strain it, but I actually feel that that is tied back to everything we've been talking about regarding gender,
Yeah.
because um, I think that the basics that we learn, like in preschool,
Yeah.
about how to be humans, right? Like be kind,
Mm-hmm.
love each other,
Mm-hmm.
love yourself,
Mm-hmm.
um, don't hurt other people, that those things are, there's a way in which I think those things get tagged as being feminine, and or like not rigorous, and or antithetical to real intellect or intellectual projects, right? That those are heart things, and that if you're really smart, you're into head things. And I think that I'm just really think it's really important for us to reclaim a politic that is rooted in kindness, a
Yeah.
politic that is rooted in love and making sure people are fed and making sure people are
That's right.
housed, and I think it relates to everything you've been saying about mutual aid and just all of it. Riley, thank you so much for being in conversation with
Uh,
me. Is there anything I did not ask you that you would really like to talk about, or just like any shout outs you want to give? You already shout out your moms.
I
So
did. I mean, I've got some family on the call. Good to see you, fam. But I also actually, if it's not too much trouble for y'all, I'd love to sign the books. So if something that we can make possible.
we love it.
Okay.
Wow.
All right.
Breaking news. Not too much trouble. No, it can definitely
Okay.
make that happen. Definitely make
Great.
that happen. Wow.
Happy to.
People are so fortunate. I might have to slide and love up for myself, get their little signature so I can keep
That's
that forever and ever. Thank you so much. Where
thank
can the
you.
people find you if they want to learn more about you and hear more about your work?
Awesome. Great. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter, and sometimes on Facebook. You can find me at
Oh, bless your heart.
sometimes. But you can find me at C. Riley Snorton on all of those platforms. And I really do invite more conversation. I'm so grateful for this invitation. It's always so good to talk to you, Eve. And
Thanks.
it's such it feels like some kind of solve in the midst of a day that has just been so full of grief. So I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
That's really how it feels to me too, and I'm really grateful to be in community with you today, and really grateful to everybody who joined us for this conversation. Let me see what else I want to say. So we have another video dropping tomorrow. People are going to be watching this in the future, but we've already said that linear time is fake. So sorry.
Okay.
In this present, we have a video of Dr. Christina M. Greer talking about Black ethnicity and immigration and identity that drops tomorrow. This is just the beginning of, and we're so grateful to you, Professor Snorton, for kicking off this lecture series. Please follow us on all the social things at Black Freedom Lectures, and check out our website, blackfreedomlectures.org. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Thank you to the Mellon Foundation. Thank you to Barb, the realist out. And thank you to you, Riley, for being here. Everybody, please take care of yourselves and each other.